206 murderers, death row inmates with blood on their hands, were exiled to a desolate Arctic island. The military dropped off supplies and keys, then left the island. A bloody conflict erupted between the different factions of prisoners in their struggle to survive. Even the worst atrocities occurred, and the original 206 prisoners were reduced to just 87 due to global humanitarian efforts. The death penalty was abolished everywhere, which led to a sharp rise in violent crime. Prisons around the world became overcrowded and became a heavy burden for governments. To address this problem, an international organization authorized by the United Nations launched an experiment called the Ice Demon Island Project. The experiment began in a Russian prison, where more than 200 death row inmates were escorted by the military aboard a modified cargo ship. Each of these prisoners was a dangerous criminal with blood on their hands. The prisoners were generally divided into three factions, one led by Chechen Muslims, another by the ruthless Mooff, and the third by Xilin, a former military man. Just by the way Mooff walks, you can tell he's not someone to mess with. His faction also included Xilin and his group of scattered soldiers. Xilin, once a highly educated pilot, lost his wife and children in a plane crash caused by negligence. In a fit of rage, Xilin shot and killed 6 staff members responsible for the crash and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Despite his past, Xilin was a kind man, though not one to let others trample on him. He held considerable respect among the prisoners. Chechens and Russians have always been enemies, so Mooff and the Muslims frequently clashed. The scattered group led by Xilin sometimes sided with Mooff, but most of the time they were indifferent, just watching from the sidelines. Not long after the ship set sail, the Muslims broke open their cell doors, leaving their prison and provoking Mooff. Mooff immediately took control of one of the Muslims in his room. The Muslim quickly conceded, asking Mooff to release his comrades. However, Mooff, being inherently violent, executed the hostage on the spot. A war broke out instantly between the factions, with the prisoners attacking each other through iron bars. The steel bars removed from the ship became their weapons. Without weapons, they fought with their bare hands, creating utter chaos. The riot was only suppressed after the soldiers fired warning shots, but it was clear that the two factions would not give up. After an unknown amount of time at sea, the military arrived at an Arctic island called Ice Demon Island to begin the 3-month experiment. The island was bleak, cold, and covered in snow year-round, an abandoned land left by God. The international organization had already built a camp on the island and provided food and various tools. There were no guards anymore, only satellite surveillance. The prisoners were free to live as they pleased. After 3 months, someone would return to check on them. A communication station was built 300 meters offshore, where the prisoners could contact the international organization in case of emergency using a device on a floating buoy. The sergeant tossed the handcuff keys on the ground and boarded the speedboat to leave. Once he was far enough away, he fired a flare to signal. Upon receiving the signal, the prisoners rushed towards the keys like animals released from their cages. They ran and fought, trampling over each other, and only a few managed to unlock their handcuffs. The Muslims, however, were more united and formed a human wall, gradually clearing the chaos and securing the keys first. While others were still fighting, most of the Muslims had already freed themselves. Before anyone could react, the Muslims quickly grabbed the tools brought by the military, axes, crowbars, and began to indiscriminately strike the others fighting over the keys. The prisoners were pushed to the sea, with no escape, and all became prisoners of the Muslims. However, the elderly Muslim leader ordered the execution of all these prisoners. One reason was revenge, the other was to conserve food so the Muslims could survive longer on the island. Several prisoners who tried to escape were killed on the spot. This ignited the fury of the Russian prisoners, who figured they were doomed anyway, so they might as well fight back. Led by Xilin, they began to resist with stones, since the Muslims were already outnumbered, and the prisoners were fighting with the last of their strength. The Muslims were quickly defeated, with the leader and his strongmen killed by rocks. Amid the chaos, 3 Muslims fled in a small boat, smashing the communication device on the buoy, planning to escape, but they didn't get far. A large wave capsized their boat, sending them to the bottom of the sea. With the Muslims annihilated, the prisoners began scavenging for supplies and settled into a brief moment of peace. However, Xilin knew that a new power structure would soon emerge, perhaps even more brutal than prison. Taking food and equipment, he left the camp, seeking to live alone. He climbed over snow-covered mountains, crossed rivers, and after some difficult travel, he finally found a sheltered spot by the shore made of natural rocks. Exhausted, he sat down and pulled out a photo of his wife and children. Though he had avenged them, His wife and children would never return. With a heavy heart, Jilin fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up, he discovered that his remaining food had been stolen by a pack of voles. Helpless, Jilin had no choice but to survive in the wilderness. When luck was on his side, he would catch a seabird for a meal. Most of the time, he could only eat sporadically. One day, Jilin was lucky enough to catch a seagull. As he prepared to feast, his former cellmate, Sipa, appeared before him, looking disheveled. It turned out that shortly after Jilin left, the camp was taken over by Mooff, who established a brutal, survival of the fittest system. The bad news was that most of the food and supplies had been ruined by voles, and food was severely scarce. Many were on the brink of death, unable to stand Mooff's tyrannical rule. Sipa had fled here. He thought Jilin had already been killed, but to his surprise, he found him here. Sipa was originally a doctor who was sentenced to life imprisonment for dissecting 22 people out of curiosity. Sipa pleaded with Jilin to take him along, as he wouldn't survive on his own. After some hesitation, Jilin agreed to accept Sipa. Sipa was overjoyed, and the two of them shared the seagull they had caught. In the days that followed, the two searched for anything edible. There were very few seabirds, and fish were scarce. It had once been Jilin alone, surviving on occasional meals, but now, with two of them, it was much harder. While trying to catch fish one day, the two unexpectedly discovered a nearly intact seaplane that had crashed there. This gave them hope of escaping, but neither of them had the ability to repair it, let alone fuel it. After nearly 2 months, the weather slowly began to resemble winter, and snowflakes started to fall. The increasingly cold temperatures made it harder for the two of them to survive. In order to stay alive, the two decided to risk returning to the camp to steal some coal to survive the winter. On the way there, Sipa fantasized that most of the camp's people had killed each other off, and only a few remained. But in reality, under Mooff's rule, the camp was a place of daily violence and cannibalism. The prisoners in the camp were divided into two groups: the red shirts, led by Mooff, and the blue shirts, who were oppressed and controlled. The red shirts lived in luxury, enjoying the remaining supplies. They ate canned food, drank wine, and engaged in various leisure activities. On the other hand, the blue shirts were forced to play deadly games under the threat of the red shirts. Every day, the blue shirts were split into 4 pairs, with 1 pair spared from the game, but they wouldn't get food either. The remaining 3 teams had to race to enter the building, and the last one to enter would be dragged out and slaughtered. The blue shirts went crazy and devoured each other. Meanwhile, Jilin and Sipa dragged their nearly frozen bodies to the outskirts of the camp. They planned to take a few bags of coal and leave, but their exhausted bodies crawled to a stone by the coal fire. Basking in the long-lost warmth, the two soon fell into a deep sleep. When Sipa opened his eyes, the blue shirts were already bringing today's rations and preparing to cook. Though Sipa desperately tried to wake Jilin and escape, Jilin was simply too tired. The two were discovered and beaten. On the brink of death, they were dragged before Mooff. Sipa, because he had stolen food during his escape, was immediately placed in the blue shirts camp. As for Jilin, Mooff believed that someone who had survived alone for 2 months must be a cunning and cruel person, so he couldn't let him stay in the camp. He was also placed in the blue shirts camp. A man from the red shirts recognized Jilin as the leader who had fought against the Muslims and felt indebted to him. He tried to rescue Jilin, however, this led to a conflict with Mooff's group, and, as expected, the man was beaten by Jilin and thrown into the blue shirts camp along with him. The next day, the 3 newcomers participated in the game for the first time. Jilin hated this inhumane game with all his heart. When the game began, he stood still, silently protesting. Sipa, who depended on him for survival, reluctantly dragged him into the building, but someone would inevitably die, and the selected prisoner was filled with fear and despair. At that moment, he whispered "Mom," but the others remained unmoved. They had become numb. To them, the prisoners about to be slaughtered were no different from a chicken. Soon, the selected prisoners were killed and eaten. After witnessing this, Jilin decided to rebel against this barbaric and inhumane act. The others, who had long suffered from the daily anxiety and infighting, were eager to rebel but had been too afraid to do so, because Jilin already had influence among the blue shirts. Many supported his proposal. The next day, when the game started again, the blue shirts stood still. Mooff came rushing over, and Jilin started negotiating with him. He proposed that they go to the floating platform to seek help. If the international organization sent food, there would be no need for these cruel games anymore. But Mooff, who still had enough food, saw this as unnecessary. Jilin immediately threw out a second condition. the nearly intact seaplane. He promised that if the blue shirts were released, he would reveal the plane's location and ensure that it could be repaired. Mooff, intrigued by the idea of an escape plane, immediately called in a red shirt technician to open the gate and release the blue shirts. Jilin then took 2 helpers and a red shirt technician to repair the communications device on the floating platform. However, as soon as Jilin left, Mooff immediately tore up the agreement and surrounded the blue shirts who had just been freed. It turned out that this was Mooff's tactic to buy time. Once he eliminated the blue shirts' leaders, their group would fall apart and be easy to control. He didn't believe in the plan at all. With only 2 leaders left among the blue shirts, Mooff ordered them to be killed. Despite a desperate resistance, the blue shirts were already too scared and quickly perished. Mooff then killed another person as a warning to the others to obey. The blue shirts, terrified, saw their hopes of rebellion crushed. As Mooff shouted for the game to begin, the blue shirts, just freed from their cages, rushed back in. A riot broke out, but Mooff easily suppressed it. Meanwhile, Jilin, still at sea, was unaware of what was happening. On the floating platform, Jilin and his group finally managed to climb aboard. However, the technician discovered that the buttons were severely damaged and couldn't be repaired. Reluctantly, the group rowed back. When they returned, members of the red shirts rushed to ask for news. Some of them, who had a good relationship with Jilin, were hoping for rescue to end this nightmare. Jilin told them that food would come soon, but Mooff didn't believe it. The female expert from the international organization had said that if they received a distress signal, a green light would appear. Mooff had seen no green light. Jilin insisted that the officer on duty had already agreed to their request. Then, the technician revealed that Jilin knew about a plane that could be repaired. Once they had fuel, they could escape together using the plane, but Mooff refused to believe it. He wanted to ensure he maintained absolute control, and Jilin was too dangerous to be left alive. At that moment, a mute person nearby mimicked the sound of a plane. Mooff, irritated, casually crushed the mute person's windpipe. The technician seized the opportunity, sprinted over, and plunged a screwdriver into Mooff's neck. At the same time, several red shirts who were already unhappy with Mooff's brutal rule quickly attacked and killed Mooff's loyal followers. With Mooff's reign over, Jilin took control of the camp and revealed to everyone that there were no supplies. After a discussion, Jilin freed the blue shirts and promised that from now on, everyone would be treated equally. Food and resources would be shared equally, but the dead must be buried, and cannibalism would never be allowed again. He also lied, saying that in 25 days, the international organization would send more supplies to calm the prisoners. Thus, the prisoners enjoyed a brief period of peace. Under Jilin's leadership, they found the seaplane, dismantled it, and brought the parts back to the camp to reassemble it. To avoid detection by the international organization, they also built a secret shelter. They hoped to repair the plane and escape this godforsaken island. 20 days later, when the 3-month deadline arrived, the international organization indeed arrived with a military ship carrying supplies. At this point, the prisoners on the island had been reduced from 206 to 87. Jilin used the excuse that the cold weather and the upcoming winter meant they needed wind power to survive, and he requested a generator and a large amount of gasoline. With the gasoline, Jilin's group could finally start the plane. However, the international organization had not only brought supplies, but also over 100 prisoners from other countries. Jilin tried to get along with others and did not provoke any conflict, but those sent here were all ruthless criminals. Moreover, the leader of these yellow-clad prisoners was one person only, Sewing, who held absolute power. There was no way Sewing would share power with anyone else. Not only did Sewing reject Jilin's wish for peaceful coexistence, but he also launched a sneak attack as soon as Jilin turned his back. In an instant, a more brutal and bloody battle began. Meanwhile, aboard a distant warship, a female expert was monitoring the battle. From her team's assessment, over 40% of the prisoners would die in this brutal skirmish. At this point, the female expert realized that the experiment of isolating death row prisoners had completely failed. Continuing was pointless, so after consulting her superiors, she issued an order to kill all the death row prisoners. As soon as the order was given, heavy weapons aboard the warship began to fire relentlessly at the fighting prisoners. In an instant, the island was filled with screams and wails. The island was no longer hell but was worse than hell itself. In just a moment, the prisoners were shot down to the last one. Afterward, a team of soldiers landed, conducted a simple search, and dealt with the bodies before quickly leaving on a boat. Jilin, who was fortunate enough to survive, and the mechanic reached the shelter. Also among the survivors were Sipa and a young boy. The four of them worked together to push the plane towards the shore, preparing to escape the island. However, at this moment, Sipa said goodbye to the others and ran alone toward the mountain, as he didn't know where to go next. Eventually, Jilin and the other two pushed the plane into the sea, filled with infinite longing for freedom, and flew away from the island. After watching the three take off, Sipa, who had climbed to the cliff, jumped off. He had seen through human nature and chose to fall into the real hell. Just as the plane was taking off, it was spotted by a nearby warship. The warship's machine guns mercilessly fired at the rear of the plane. The young boy and the mechanic were killed instantly. Dying in the plane, Jilin managed to fly the plane out of the attack range, piercing through thick clouds as he flew toward the sunlight. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.